All right, so welcome everyone to this webinar. Just a word about Plato to those of you maybe who are new to Plato. We're the philosophy learning and teaching organization. We have a mission of sharing philosophy with young people around the world. We do this through work in classrooms in our Philosophers in the School program. We work with educators to help train them to do philosophy with young people. We have graduate students who go in and do philosophy with young people. And we think really carefully about how to provide spaces for people to be able to think and talk together about big ideas. And so this is one of them. Our student advisory council is made up of high school students and led by Stephen Miller as their faculty person. Um, and they are a wonderful group of young people, and they have put together a webinar for us that they're going to lead and do entirely on their own. It's entitled Being Yourself Inside Modern Day Absurdity, and thinking about the ways in which social media and presentation of self on social media generates a whole ton of existential questions about who we are and how we represent ourselves and those kinds of things. So I will, in a moment, hand it over to the moderator, Mina. And then Mina will introduce the panelists, and there'll be some questions and answers, and they'll be talking. Feel free to post questions in the chat or comments in the chat, and then there'll be time for Q&A and discussion. So at Plato, we love our Q&A not so much to be sort of drilling the panelists as much as it is a sort of discussion and a thinking together, a community of inquiry, right? Where we can all think together. Um, so we'll approach it in that spirit. And I am sure it's going to be a fascinating conversation. So, Mina is the co-lead of the Student Advisory Council and has agreed to moderate tonight. I will just say on Mina's behalf that she was not scheduled to moderate tonight, so she is stepping in, pinch hitting, I think they call it, um, at the last minute. And I know she's going to do a great job. So, Mina's going to be the moderator, and she's a student at Oakwood Friends School, comes from London, came to do high school here, and is, like I said, one of the leaders of our student advisory council. So I'll hand it over to you, Mina. If you all need anything from me, I'm here. And I look forward to hearing all you have to say.
Thank you, Karen. So, yes, to begin, we're just gonna go around and everyone's gonna introduce themselves, talking a bit about how they got into philosophy, and also what their presence online may look like if they have any. So, I will start. As you heard, I'm Mina. I go to Oakwood Friends School. I grew up in London and I recently moved to New York, and I got into philosophy mostly through my school. Prior to coming to school here, I went to a school that offered very little philosophy opportunities, and I was lucky enough to then go to school here where there are a lot of philosophy and ethics based classes. And so I just started taking a bunch of those, and I joined my school's high school ethics board team. And then as for my presence online, I don't really have one. I try to not really use social media. I just found it's not really for me. So let's go on to Rania.
Hi, my name's Rania. I live in London and I go to Westminster School, and I joined Plato about 2 years ago. And I'm a student of ancient Greek and Latin, and that's what sort of first drew me into philosophy. And I'm primarily interested in the intersection between philosophy and classics. And I really love drawing in sort of like modern day philosophies to the ancient texts I read. So recently at school, I gave a post-colonial reading of the Odyssey, which was very exciting. And unlike Mina, I'm someone who actually actively uses social media quite a bit, like TikTok and Instagram. But through using these, I often find myself thinking about how identity can both feel personal but also performative online. And I think tonight what particularly interests me is the perspective of women and how authenticity, I think, in social media can be shaped by social expectations, gender norms, and feminist ideas. And I'm really interested to further explore that today.
Thank you. Okay, Gopika.
Hello. I'm a sophomore and I'm from Connecticut. I got into philosophy through my debate club, my middle school debate club. And since then, I've been really interested in combining philosophy with my interest in history. And then also, similar to Rania, I've been studying the classics, so Latin and ancient Greek, and I've been really interested in connecting those two interests. As for my presence online, I downloaded social media about a little bit less than a year ago. And I use it maybe like half an hour or so a day. Um, and I don't really post that much, so it's really been more of like an observing experience. Yeah.
Thank you. And Justin?
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm a junior and I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the United States. I first got into philosophy in middle school, where I was interested in a lot of the bigger questions, and then through that, I directly got involved in philosophy. And ever since, I took some ethics classes at Georgetown, and I've done some summer programs studying philosophy at Yale and Stanford. And then I brought a lot of those things back to my school with philosophy access. So I founded my own philosophy club and ethics bowl team, and that's been great this year. Personally, I've had social media since middle school, but I've also not been someone who's super active. I use Instagram and Snapchat, but I've not been someone who's used them a lot or posts a lot in that. But I have been reading a book actually recently from Bernard Williams titled Truth and Truthfulness, and they talk a lot about the definition of truthfulness and authenticity. So I'm really interested to continue exploring that today with our conversations.
Thank you. Um, Now we're going to move on to just talking about what being authentic actually means and how and what that may look like today, in a time where, there's so many different forms of social media and platforms, um, and also maybe just overall views on the topic as a whole. So anyone feel free to jump in and say that.
I think the notion of authenticity within social media is really interesting because, in my opinion, so much of social media is curated and sort of performed for external viewers. So I think at times we lose this like authenticity and being true to ourselves. But then I think there's also this desire to almost like sort of express like reality. So many influencers, I feel like today are like really popular because they feel relatable, because they feel like they're being themselves, because they're being funny and maybe imperfect. So I also think, while simultaneously there is this sort of like performative degree of it, at the same time, I think there's this desire for all of us, especially as users of social media, to sort of like see this authenticity within others.
Yeah, sort of to go off of that. I think, of course, like Rania was saying, social media is often really curated, but I think in a lot of cases it can sort of empower people to sort of act more authentically in the sense that it can introduce them to new communities of like-minded individuals. And I think that can be really helpful, especially for younger people when they're trying to act authentically. However, I think something that's come up more so in recent years is this idea of authenticity being like an um, sort of an end goal on social media, with people trying to act in certain ways that might make them like present as more authentic. And I think um, so there you sort of see the contrast between like authenticity as like a being thing or a becoming thing. And I think authenticity is sort of like inherently a process. And so I'm not sure if social media necessarily allows for that process to happen.
Yeah, and Ronnie, I know you briefly mentioned about how gender can play a role in one's authenticity online. Um, and I was wondering if you could just maybe expand more on that and how it may either restrict someone's ability to be authentic or maybe heighten it.
Yeah, completely. I think that's really interesting. Um, I really like Simone de Beauvoir's notion of one is not born but becomes a woman, because I actually think sort of social media exemplifies this in a way, in that we learn this femininity through performance and through all these ideas that I think are really perpetuated on social media. We have like beauty filters, certain body standards, makeup trends, clothing, lifestyle, and those all, I think, specifically for women, create this pressure that is so much like it almost feels sort of like innocuous. It's so like subtle we don't even realize it because we're just scrolling. But it's this pressure to like become society's notion of an acceptable woman. And I think that again through social media this becomes quite pattern, and this idea of like having a public performance, a public persona, maybe limits our authenticity as women in some ways, to exist like autonomously without sort of the influence of other things.
Kind of building off of that idea, I think it would be interesting to talk about how social media has sort of affected our own perception of our outward beings and how it's maybe forced people to recultivate both their inward identity but also the one that they present out to broader society, both like online and in their community. And I know, Gopika, you touched a bit on how one may be able to come to a increasingly authentic version of themselves through engagement with online communities. So maybe just expanding on that topic a bit.
Yeah, definitely. Um, in that point, I think I was trying to talk about how, so like a lot of people, maybe if they don't have access to certain, or they're not really introduced to a lot of people like within their necessarily like their geographical location or like within their town, who have similar interests to them, they might face a lot of pressures to sort of become like the people around them. And so I think that one of the like greatest things about social media is that you're able to interact with so many people, and just be introduced to so many people. It's like completely unprecedented by other forms of technology. But I do think that with that, there are a lot of like risks involved, especially with the way that algorithms are built, with algorithmic validation. And so while, joining social media might allow you to be introduced to new communities, it might sort of like force you to become a part of those communities. And especially with, I'm not sure um, if people are familiar with the term of like a filter bubble. Um, but it's like an online version of an echo chamber where you're being surrounded by specifically people who reinforce what you believe. And so yeah, I think it's sort of a double-edged sword where there are a lot of potential benefits to meeting new people. But I don't think that meeting new people necessarily frees you from the risk of like external pressures.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I really like that idea about social media unlocking a sense of authenticity and that it's so accessible for so many people. So many people can access all this like people's knowledge, other people's experiences, in a way that I think is so like unique to it. I think what you were talking about also sort of reminded me of Foucault and maybe his notion of like self-surveillance, and how maybe because of these algorithms, like the filter bubble you said, and this like constant sort of like reinforcement of content that you want to see, um, like it this idea of like internalized surveillance almost becomes intensified. And maybe we again feel this pressure to conform more, to appear certain ways, and to fit into certain standards.
I think also at the base of all of this is the question of, is there inherent value in being authentic? Um, does that hold something that is that something that is important? And I think um, to be able to really get into this topic, it's important that we broach the question of is there value in actually being authentic?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'll start by talking about I think for the concept of authenticity as a whole, there's kind of two aspects to it. And the first is being authentic to oneself, and then the second being how one's perceived. Because inherently, I think that that's something very important whenever we're thinking about what authenticity means. And talking about the value of authenticity, I think the value of it really lies in being truthful to oneself, or what's like often the notion of like being true to oneself. But I think inherently being authentic to oneself is being true to oneself in whatever that may be. And so I think that in a similar way that a lot of, I guess, moral ideas are very against the idea of lying. Kant very famously was against lying because that was a very, he believed, a self-destructive practice. And I think very similarly, if we think about being inauthentic as being not truthful to oneself or not being true to oneself, I think that very similarly can show the value in being authentic, or in this like case, kind of synonymously with to true to oneself. And I think that that is, I guess, a way that we can assign value to authenticity from an individual perspective rather than simply viewing it from how others perceive the individual.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think there is such a great value in authenticity. I was thinking a little bit about social media and I guess like the idea of doom scrolling, and you're like perpetually scrolling and it feels like you've almost lost the sense of meaning. And I think maybe that's where authenticity comes in to sort of help that, in that maybe at times we can feel like, especially within like social media, that like things begin to lose meaning. What's the point? And maybe you get almost like these nihilist ideas. And I think that authenticity helps us sort of like have like regain a sense of integrity and agency, which I think is so important for meaning. Yeah, I think there's a great value to authenticity.
And I think especially now with you know the the rapid rate at which society is advancing technologically with AI, I feel that at least authenticity will become increasingly important. But um, I do wonder for like the rest of you, do you view or do you think that authenticity is a virtue, will become like a virtuous trait for a person to have? Do you think it already is a virtue? Is it something that's going to become a virtue in the future? And then how would that play into trying to lead maybe a more moral based, ethical life as a whole?
I think that question is really interesting because it's as Justin had mentioned earlier, it's quite difficult to, gauge how authentic someone is being because their version of being true to themselves, really lies like within themselves. And so unless you're seeing authenticity as this like external manifestation of and that's like how you're defining it, I don't like I think that the way that society views it in general is authenticity is valued, but only like insofar as it conforms to certain um I like other ideals that we have. So if being authentic means that you're producing like great art, let's say, that act of producing great art is something that we consider um virtuous, or sorry, ideal. And so in that regard we might value authenticity, but I don't think that we or a lot of people value it to the extent that they're willing to neglect some of their own or abandon some of their own other values.
Yeah, I also wonder if we'd sort of take like an existentialist viewpoint in that authenticity maybe means acknowledging like one's own freedom, and it's sort of like refusing to conform or like hide behind another role. And I think in acknowledging one's freedom, you almost take responsibility for your actions. So I think authenticity, even like beyond finding meaning or being content within oneself, it like becomes this very ethical thing in which you almost become, by acknowledging your own authenticity, you acknowledge that you're like a responsible agent. You have control over your life, but you also have impacts on other people as well. And I think that's like a very powerful decision to make.
Definitely. And I also think that's really interesting on social media in particular, going back to that idea of a filter bubble where you're sort of surrounded by like-minded people and people who share your sort of same beliefs. It becomes a lot more difficult to make choices as to whether you'd like to, continue aligning with those beliefs. And it sort of resembles a joke that Jean-Paul Sartre brings up in his work entitled Being and Nothingness. And so the premise of the joke is that a man walks into a cafe and he asks for a coffee with sugar but no cream. And then the waiter says, "Oh, we don't have cream. How about no milk?" And I think that sort of that idea sort of can be seen on social media, where a lot of times um, people sort of, once they enter like a formed community of whether it's like political ideologies or whatever, they're sort of not really exposed to different options and different, so they don't really have that freedom of choice. And like Rania was saying, I think authenticity is sort of predicated on choosing something, and in that regard, social media and algorithms sort of remove that ability to choose.
Sort of building off of the idea of being authentic, being a sort of virtue or something that is important, would then, if someone were to have a version of themselves online where maybe they represented different values than they seem to represent in person or spewed a different opinion, basically being some form of inauthentic version of themselves online, would that then be sort of an immoral or unethical thing to do?
Um, I think that it could be almost sort of like not necessarily a good or bad thing and completely like a neutral act where maybe you don't even realize that you're expressing a certain persona online. Um, I was actually thinking a bit about Kierkegaard and how he talks about when people think they're being authentic, they're actually following the crowd, his notion that society says, oh, we're all Christians. And if you take that example, maybe think about um, if we maybe feel that we're all informed and we're all authentic and we're expressing ourselves freely online, but there are all these trends and sort of like very subtle things that maybe we don't realize that we're being influenced by. And then the like performance, like it becomes something that's like socially validated. It's not something inwardly chosen or authentic, but I don't necessarily think it's always because someone has bad intention or good intention, and it purely could be because they just don't realize that they're being influenced by others.
I would say on this point, I think if one is misrepresenting themselves in their own beliefs, then I would say that that is a personally inauthentic idea. And so I guess if you want to follow on that train, that it would be kind of immoral. I think, Mina, as you mentioned before, thinking about authenticity as a virtue, I think is a much better framing of authenticity as something to strive for. Because I think inherently because we have different opinions and are inherently influenced by a lot of external factors, and that our opinions themselves may change as well, I think that representing different opinions, as long as you're being true to oneself, is not necessarily wrong. But I think that again, authenticity is a very, I guess, like interpersonal idea, and that it's, I think, less about perception and more about an individual striving, if we want to think of it again, like in a very typical virtue ethicist idea. It's going to be something where you're striving to be true to oneself. And what that is at certain moments may represent different values or different opinions. But I think that the most important idea results from an interpersonal relationship, of being authentic or truthful to oneself and striving for that and whatever that may be, even though that may change over time, and what that manifests in, I guess, for other people viewing that.
Um, I think that's really interesting. I slightly disagree in that if you don't represent your own beliefs, that's something that's like morally condemned, like that's something immoral. Because I also wonder what happens like within social media where you have like if you're like an influencer or like a social media identity, like you have this very cultivated persona and a certain identity. So sometimes I feel like you're unable to express certain beliefs, maybe for fear of cancel culture, losing followers, if it's like part of your profession. It could be and I don't necessarily think that's an immoral thing to do. And I think not just within social media, but like within most of like how we like live our life. Lots of times I don't think we always truly represent our own beliefs or we present certain beliefs to certain people. And I think that's inevitable, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's a completely immoral thing because I think sometimes we don't have as much of a choice in that.
I definitely agree with Reina and the things that you're saying, and that online especially, there are times in which we can't necessarily show everything and represent all of our beliefs. And that's something I definitely agree with. But at the same time, I think that the slight nuance is in obligation to show certain ideas. And I think that the it's different lies in that I don't think people are obligated to represent their beliefs, or that necessarily withholding showing everyone your beliefs isn't something that would be morally condemnable. But I do believe that representing different beliefs and also putting that onto a different platform, I would say that is something that would be inauthentic to oneself, and in opposition to simply not showing or not fully representing one's belief. I think withholding certain opinions to the right people to the right extent is something that is actually a very virtuous and moral thing to do. But I would say misrepresenting oneself and showing a different belief than one would personally hold for those people as well, I think would be more immoral in that sense.
Um, yeah, and I know we've like come up throughout this part of the conversation, it's come up a lot about how there are so many different opinions that we're constantly hearing on social media, and also, in addition to that, so much advertising that we're consuming, both consciously and subconsciously. And with all of these different opinions, adverts, you need this, you need that, with all these different things we're hearing, do you think that it has become harder to be authentic today, among all of the noise of social media? Or, kind of going back to your point, Gopika, has it actually made it easier because you're able to determine what you resonate with and what you don't because you're hearing so much, um, and also exposed to so many different opinions that you may not otherwise be exposed to?
Um, I think that I would say that it's become harder to be authentic purely because I think social media is so incredibly pervasive and impactful in our lives, but at the same time, it feels a bit innocuous. I think sometimes it's hard to um, realize that we're being influenced because it's just like such a integral, like normalized part of our life. And I think that it almost like creates this sort of passive nature in like how we think, how we like scroll. We're not really like considering how we're being influenced. So then if we do lose like our authenticity because we're like following whatever like algorithms, like cliche ideas like this like viral language that everyone sort of follows, is like this unthinking participation rather than like this intent to deliberately be inauthentic. That comes about, which I think can be somewhat dangerous. But I wonder what Gopika has to say, because I know that you think maybe slightly different.
I completely agree. Or I agree mostly, I think, about definitely like the impact of the pervasiveness of social media. I don't think that social media in and of itself um, sort of worsens or like makes achieving authenticity more difficult. I think a lot of the concerns about maintaining authenticity on social media are present, like in day-to-day life. If you're talking about like, curating a like an a personal or an online persona, that's something that people I think do um, every day when they're switching between like because like people would present themselves differently to like their friends versus their colleagues at work or their teachers at school and things like that. So I think that what social media does is it sort of like intensifies or not necessarily intensifies, but it like really brings those um issues sort of like to the forefront. When you think about like things like it like quantifies or things like the gaze that Sarsha talks about into sort of like concrete metrics like likes and comments. And so I think in that regard, especially with how much of a like how much it's been normalized, it's the presence of social media has definitely made achieving authenticity much more difficult. But I don't think that like social media necessarily alone has worsened um, that process.
I think it was briefly mentioned earlier about sort of quantifying authenticity, and more of like a baseline question in this whole discussion is like how could we measure authenticity, and is that even something that is measurable really, or no?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Um, I wonder if there's like a sort of way to measure authenticity in sort of like what one actively expresses and says they do, what one says that they support, what one says that they sort of advocate for, and then how one actually asks. So like between um what you like say to society, what you put out to the world, what you say your beliefs are, and then if you actually do those beliefs, I think that could be one way in which you sort of measure your authenticity and if you're being true to yourself. And there's this correlation, I think, being true to yourself and being true to what you've told others you are.
It's a really interesting question, and it actually reminds me, I think, of an ethics bowl case. Maybe it was a year ago, but it was about social media and our different obligations to posting for advocating for certain events and whether that's something that we're obligated to do or not. Because with a lot of major events in the world, it's very common for people to post on their story about different events or protests or all these different things in support, or I guess it could be against certain ideas. And so I thought it was really interesting regarding the differences in our obligation, and also, as Raina was mentioning, if people are truly following through on these beliefs, because a lot of times things will happen like a chain in which someone will post something and then you can repost it and continue on what you could, I guess, consider a trend in that way. And so I think with the, I guess, tool or possibly detrimental tool of social media, I was wondering if you guys had any other opinions on this idea of obligation, then to try to advocate for certain ideas that we believe in, and also whether or not it's wrong to then post something that you don't necessarily feel as strongly about for different reasons.
Yeah, I would even question with this idea of like posting certain things like big events. I know sometimes like politically or like with sports people repost these things. I would just even question whether reposting those things in the first place has an impact at all. I think obligation is really interesting and I completely agree with it, but I wonder if simply reposting something online actually does anything, if that counts as like actually actively doing something to help whatever cause one claims to support. And maybe then within like this sphere of social media, we get this idea that, oh, we're helping if we like a video that perpetuate like that says a certain message. And we feel like we're doing something when actually I think maybe it's not as impactful as we perceive it to be.
Yeah, I think the sort of detriment of I think what you're describing is sort of like performative activism, especially like among influencers, and I guess like everyday people as well. I think that the issue sort of comes when people assume that their actions have this like inflated impact. And I think, posting or making a small post on social media for a specific movement or cause, I don't think it's harmful necessarily by itself, but if that's the extent of it, and it's sort of like a checkbox that you're checking off and moving on with your life. And so this sort of connects to what Rania was saying about like what you put forth in your actual actions. I think that's where the issue with performative activism comes in, is where like unless I don't think it's an issue by itself, but if it's replacing actual action and things like that, then it becomes problematic.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I actually remember that ethics bowl case too. But to bring this idea sort of out of the realm of just social media and expand it further into like broader life and society, do you think that being silent can be being authentic if you maybe don't speak out about something that you feel passionate about, that is something you deeply value? Um, is that being authentic? And then also in like a more specific case, kind of expanding this whole topic, do we owe it to people to not be silent and speak on what your values are? And if someone is saying something or making a claim that goes against that, are we obliged to then comment and not be silent?
Um, I think maybe we can make a distinction between like two like ideas of silence, like inauthentic silence, and authentic silence. And I wonder, with inauthentic silence, if we can take the idea of like, for example, women in the past and sort of like sexist ideas that discourage women from speaking publicly, or like dominant narratives or ideas that again silence women. And I think that that would be considered like inauthentic silence. That's not necessarily a desire to not say anything to state a point, but because of sort of like structural reasons instead. But then maybe authentic silence. I think that could be a true form of authenticity because I think maybe if you have the choice to withhold your speech, that could be an expression of your autonomy. Like sometimes in politics, like politicians will just refuse to answer a question. And I think like this idea of like no comment, that in itself is saying something that in itself I think is like an authentic expression of a stance or belief. Yeah, so I think maybe there are two veins to this idea of silence.
I
Yeah.
completely agree. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, please
You can
go.
go. Okay. I completely agree with Rania's point. And I also think that um, going back to the idea of inauthentic silence, if silence is something, or if you're being silent and you actually do feel passionate about an issue, I would say, and this is like in a perfect world, I think I think people are sort of, or should be obligated to share that, because I guess like in a perfect world where everyone's sharing their, personal beliefs, it becomes like that sort of creates this tension. And I think that tension is what allows for choice and what allows for authenticity, because you can't remove external influence entirely, but if you can sort of like, I guess you're not really neutralizing it, but you know, bring down its power by also bringing up like conflicting viewpoints, I think that's really important. And I think in that sense, an authentic silence sort of stops that from happening if silence is something that, because silence sort of like feeds into the majority. It's
Yeah, I was going to say I agree with both points, and I definitely think it's hard to just blanket silence as a positive or negative thing. I think it really takes silence is an important tool that takes prudence for one to understand when to use and when not to use. Because as some of my panelists have mentioned before, silence oftentimes, if everyone is silent, they'll play into the majority and it'll leave a lot of people as bystanders, which lets a lot of horrible things happen and has let horrible things happen in the course of history. But at the same time, I think not using silence at all and always, I guess, standing up for one's beliefs can also incite a lot of conflict in people clashing their ideas. And I think that in certain spheres, that's not always the best and necessary. And so I would agree with what a lot of people are saying in that silence is a very important tool, and authentic silence is also a very important tool. But it takes a lot of prudence and understanding when one needs to speak up and when one can also be silent and what silence has to say about that.
Yeah, and I kind of also wanted to connect this topic back a bit to the webinar that we did last year because I think they both kind of operate within the same sphere. Um, and it got me thinking a bit about um, obstacles that get in the way of being authentic and talking about, how cancel culture can play a part in one's inability to maybe be authentic because they feel as though they may be penalized for the views they have. And I think it would be interesting if we kind of um, start to discuss that a bit and why one may be unable to be authentic. And in a situation where one is feeling threatened for the views they hold, what's the right thing to do, or what is the most ethical thing to do?
Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot as well, the intersection between this year's topic and last year's. And I think that cancel culture can definitely get in the way of authenticity. Um, because then I think we have this again, this idea of like lots of external forces, external people getting in the way of what we truly want to do, what we truly want to say. And that might cause us to like, as I talked about earlier, like self-censor, this idea of self-surveillance, choose safer options that might not necessarily align with our ideas as much. Um, but at the same time, I think it's kind of hard within like the world of social media to not have to not sort of sometimes like suppress your ideas because I think it's so, as we talked about in last year's webinar, it's so easy to become cancelled, to have like a belief that doesn't align with someone else's which might cause a lot of anger. And I think especially within social media, within this like cultivated very curated personality, to hold on to that platform, to hold on to followers, sometimes I think that silence is necessary.
Switching topics a bit, but still on the topic of authenticity, do you think it is harder to find meaning now, maybe, than it would have been before social media? And has social media sort of diluted meaning in the sense that there's a lot of people who just say things to say things and get people to click on their like social media, whatever. So sort of just spewing inauthentic opinions and views in order to have some sort of gain. And so has that made it harder for us to find meaning now?
Yeah, I think I would say that it's become more difficult to find meaning. Um, Something that social media does, I think, and specifically with like informational content, journalism or like yeah, journalistic content or yeah. Um, I think it sort of levels a lot of different viewpoints, and that can be something that's really difficult or particularly harmful when those viewpoints sort of clash about like basic facts. And so, like I've seen videos, for example, and it's like putting someone who believes in like flat Earth next to a scientist, and it's like there's no real discourse that's going to happen in between those two people. And I think that sort of connects to what you were saying about how it oh my gosh, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, it connects to what you were saying about how social media sort of dilutes real journalism, and it sort of puts forth like fake conflict in order to, garner attention and traction.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you've said. And I wonder if social media hasn't so much as like removed meaning or diluted meaning, but maybe changed the conditions under which we view and sort of understand meaning. Um, so I was thinking again about like existentialist point of view in that meaning like isn't caused from society or tradition, but like we as humans create our own meaning through choice and commitment. So I wonder almost if social media um like could almost amplify in certain ways our search for meaning because of its like accessible nature. Um, if we have like so many different lifestyles and views on point, there's more freedom, there's more accessibility to these things. Um, and maybe that could almost help improve our like idea of meaning. Though at the same time, I agree with Gopika, and in that, I also think that sometimes it's not even that two ideas become completely leveled, but almost the absurd one gets more importance placed on it because it will get more views. It sort of like incites more like viewer engagement. So I think that there's like both like a positive and negative strand in social media. And I also then wonder maybe it depends on who you are as a social media user, what your algorithm looks like, whether you're seeing all these outrageous things and sort of being fueled by that fire, which might dilute meaning, or if you're using it in a more sort of, I don't know if moral is the right word, but a more useful way where it almost amplifies your ideas of meaning.
I do sometimes wonder, and this isn't necessarily a question to respond to, but I do feel that now it may be, and we've mentioned this before, harder to be authentic, but mostly due to the fact that there is so much content out at the moment that is made to appeal to our subconscious in a way that we're not even aware of, and how this really challenges our ability to be authentic, because how do we know that the idea is actually ours and not one that has been, you know, planted within an image to make us feel a certain way and think a certain way, and how that may make it harder for us to be authentic without our even knowing it. But aside from that, I do want to briefly touch on AI, though I think it is a saturated topic at the moment. I think it's important to touch on, and the thing that comes to my mind is, um, people using AI for school assignments. Being a student, that's something I hear a lot about now, and whether or not we can use AI in a way that is authentic, or is AI in and of itself inauthentic, and the human use of AI is that inauthentic because it's drawing information straight from online. It's not necessarily rooted in your own personal experience. But if AI can be used authentically, what would that look like?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Um, I think that I definitely agree that AI takes away a lot of authenticity and like original thought. Um, but I wonder, as you said, if it were to ever sort of have like a positive impact on authenticity, if we consider maybe like the view of ownership, if these are like someone's own ideas and they're using it as like a means to research something or gather more information about it, then perhaps it could be seen as like a way that intensifies one's authenticity. But at the same time, I feel like so much of it means that we just lose our own ideas. We lose like ownership and authorship. And I think those impacts are so incredibly detrimental. And I would be cautious to say that it did more good than harm.
Yeah, going off of that, I think one of the main arguments for artificial intelligence and its benefits is that it like allows you to explore your own interests or other pursuits, sort of like bypassing the less important aspects of it. So if you're like and I like you we can see this in the like technological sphere and things like that. Um, but I think it sort of becomes it like especially in a classroom setting, in humanities subjects, especially like Rania was saying, its presence sort of discourages original thought. For younger students, even where I think it can be discouraging to see that there's this really easy tool and it might perform better than you. Um, that is sort of disillusioning and it like forces it doesn't really encourage like personal growth, and I think that's really the crux of authenticity. um so while I do think that it's possible for artificial intelligence to like enable authenticity in some regards, I think it's sort of become a gradually like a bit of a replacement for like human and individual thought.
I agree, and I think it was a great point that Gopika brought up that I was thinking about actually recently, because I think that AI is definitely a very precarious topic right now, and a lot of people aren't sure about the positive or potentially negative benefits. And I know personally, in my grade, I know that our teachers are trying to teach it to us and present it to us as a tool, and I know that a lot of people in my grade actually use it very well as a tool to help them research and also help them in their process of how they already do things, again, as that kind of tool to help assist them. But I think it's really interesting to think about the younger generation, as Kopika talked about, who have always learned about AI as something that could assist them in writing or doing other things in that sense. And I think it's actually quite dangerous in that way for shaping certain habits, because for at least even in my case of like, I don't want to speak for like my generation, but the people in my grade, I can think for at least they already have the tools to do a lot of the things that they need to, whether it be research or write. And so it's much easier to use that as a tool. But I think for younger children who don't necessarily haven't necessarily foundationally developed those certain ways of doing things, I feel like AI is a very convenient way for them to I guess reach a product without developing the skills. And I think that's something that could very much so I guess take the place of a lot of authentic habits that they build as they're growing up in a world with AI, and AI is something that's constantly evolving.
Still, in the topic of I think that one interesting thing to think about is as we're being introduced to this sort of new entity, which like isn't a living being, how do we attribute what we have created as human virtues to something like AI and can AI even be authentic, or can it not even be described in such a way because it's such a different entity that it can't be prescribed the same sorts of values that we attribute to humans?
Personally, I don't think AI can ever be authentic because I define authenticity as something that that sort of requires a conscious subject because I think the freedom to choose is so integral to authenticity. This like responsible of choice, having a lived experience. I think those are all such integral components of being authentic. And so I would say that AI can't ever be, though it could maybe emulate certain like other human virtues, just not authenticity.
I agree, and I think this relates to the idea of authenticity sort of being a process. It's not like an end goal, but it's something that's sort of built over time based on the decisions that you make and the actions that you take. And I think that artificial intelligence, like its sole purpose is to um like accomplish a certain objective. It doesn't place any value in that process. And you can see this in like the way that it approaches certain issues. Like I think we've seen in the past, um, or actually, for an example, like if you're asking an artificial intelligence model to reduce like ocean acidification, it's gonna sure it might like produce a solution for that, but it might do so at the expense of other things that we value. And so you can keep on feeding it certain like certain exceptions and things like that, but it ultimately can't inherently like or entirely emulate, like you were saying, like Ronnie was saying, um a human in that sense. And so I don't think it can be authentic.
I agree with that, and I think that ties in a lot in what we consider the differences between humans and AI in that sense. Because oftentimes AI can produce a very similar product to what we would consider something that a human could produce. But I think oftentimes, and I think in the same case as authenticity, the question of autonomy is definitely a very important one. And I think that in the same way, we can see that authenticity requires, I guess, someone to be autonomous or something to be autonomous for it to be authentic. And I think that if we think about authenticity as a process, as a virtue, then that becomes abundantly more clear in that authenticity requires autonomy.
Yeah, thank you. Those were all really interesting points. Um, we're now going to shift more onto the Q&A section of the webinar. So I know Karen mentioned this at the beginning, but if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and I will read them out. But to start, we have a question on how should one treat the probability of inauthenticities or fake news on social media?
Um, I think that's a really great question. I think that's not something just confined to social media. I think fake news, is something that we get in lots of things. I think, yes, it is maybe particularly amplified in social media, and that it's harder to fact check things. And again, things, maybe more outrageous things are said as a means to um, sort of rack up more views or engagement. Um, I also wonder if there's a distinction between inauthenticity and fake news. Um, being inauthentic to oneself might be you just sort of like, I don't know, show a particular personality or persona on social media. I'm even thinking of people who like on TikTok like act out like funny characters and that sort of thing. That might not be being authentic to oneself, but I don't think it's necessarily has like as bad repercussions as fake news does. So yeah, I would say that maybe you can be the the like repercussions of being inauthentic aren't as bad as maybe fake news.
I think also that in terms of like how we should treat the probability of inauthenticities or fake news, um, I think it means that we basically have to make sure we're more aware of it, and fact checking sources, and even if it is a trustworthy source, trying to fact check the thing that they're saying the best you can to the best of your ability is becoming increasingly important. And also, I think that there's a lot that can be taken from hearing from diverse sets of views and opinions too. So just a combination of viewing different media, trying your best to verify your media in an attempt to combat and mitigate your consumption and belief in things that may be inauthentic or just fake. Another question was about existentialism and its long-standing critique of seeing values as subjective, and whether this is something that you guys worry about.
I think on social media in recent years, like especially like particularly recently, I'd say that like the idea of values being subjective, it's definitely come up a lot, but I think it's sort of transcended also into, basic facts to an extent as well. I think that at a certain point, or like we've reached a degree of polarization sort of, where not just values are being viewed as subjective, but we're like, sort of changing the definition of a value to an extent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what's being maybe implied in this critique is that if everything's subjective, we choose our own values. We could say that being a bad person is a good value. But I actually think that within existentialism, like for example, de Beauvoir says that like her own freedom only makes sense among other free beings, and thus denying others' freedom contradicts the very basis of her own. And maybe I think that combats this issue of subjectivity in that it should be an important factor in our own authenticity to ensure others' authenticness as well. Yeah.
I think that, I guess, broadly thinking about existentialism and their responses, the tricky thing, and this is existential, there are a lot of different existential thinkers, so they have a lot of different opinions on this, but broadly speaking, with they're trying to face, I guess, two major questions, and that's being one of them being objectivism, and then the other being just pure moral relativism. And these are both very, I guess, tricky things for them to combat because they both reach, I guess, very different conclusions. And so often the question of existentialism and facing this idea that a lot of these values are subjective comes in rejecting these two ideas of objectivism and then also just pure relativism in very different ways. And so a lot of times the onus is on oneself in creating values, and not that they're necessarily purely, I guess, relativist, but it's in the process of creating these personal values that's so important. And so uh, again, I feel like a lot of the thinkers have very different ideas on how to reject purely relativist ideas. Um, but it's just a very hard question for a lot of these existentialists to think about. In that many people still do think that there are a lot of issues with relativism and existentialism.
Sort of still in the vein of subjectivity, there's a question about can someone be wrong in about their authenticity, and this is in the context of people opposing vaccines or science in general due to beliefs. And so, though there may be concrete scientific evidence or proof against what they may believe, can their views still be authentic, or is it entirely subjective?
I think that someone can always be authentic. And I think that maybe authenticity is sort of the same thing as sincerity. People genuinely feel this way. People genuinely feel like they disagree with a certain point of view. And actually, um, again, I think that's an expression of their own personal freedom, which is such a core part of authenticity. I think maybe things being wrong or right is, in my opinion, a completely separate sort of like factor that doesn't really, that's, yeah, I don't think that's something that one should be concerned about in authenticity because I think it's deeply depends on um, each person and what they like view something to be.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, like, I guess we touched a little bit on this before, but like truth and authenticity aren't two distinct ideas, with truth being accuracy and the reality of what something is, and whether something can be objectively true or not is its own question. But authenticity being its own thing about being true about oneself. And so I think the difference there is authenticity being something about using things to the best of your knowledge to best represent what you try to believe, versus necessarily having to be correct or true in that sense. And so, again, I definitely agree with Reina in that these are two different things that don't always have to be true, and one doesn't always have to be correct to be authentic in that way.
Karen, I know you've raised your hand. Um,
Is that okay?
yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding correctly the view. It's sounding like what I'm hearing is that you can be profoundly authentic and also profoundly wrong. So like if I'm a flat earther and I'm just all in on the earth being flat and I believe it in my core, that can be authentically me even though I'm factually incorrect. Is that right? Yeah, so that's so interesting that authenticity can separate, right? Like, I think you're hitting on something so interesting here around the separation between authenticity and truth. That you can have a completely warped worldview, but still be very authentically yourself. It's really interesting. So thanks. I just wanted to clarify.
Think one more thing building on that is I think, well, as we were saying, like, yes, we believe that's true. But at the same time, being truly authentic is not like necessarily being in denial about certain things in that way. I think mainly it's about taking the information that one has and doing the best to be true to oneself and true to their ideas. So I think, like, yes, it's possible for one to authentically believe certain things that are like very, I guess one could say, incorrect, but they would have to be authentically believing them with the information that they have in the ways that they have them, and trying to be truthful to themselves about what they think. And so if that is the conclusion that they reach with what they have, then yes, you can be authentic in that way without being true, necessarily correct or true. But I think a lot of it lies, again, as we were talking about, like relativism, it's not necessarily that one is authentic merely by just thinking certain things, but a lot of it comes in this, like, I suppose, this virtue of trying to be true to oneself and understanding oneself. And I think being authentic is a very personal process in that same way, where you're striving to be true to oneself, as much as you can.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, like you were saying, so authenticity can sort of manifest in being like steadfast to your own values. But I do think that a lot of times it's used to sort of like almost mask intentional ignorance, sort of. So if your views on a certain topic are inhibiting you from going out and seeking other perspectives and other um, ideas about that topic, I think it's important to consider, and like in the most authentic way possible, I guess, whether that's because that's an intentional choice that's being made, sort of. And so is that authentically because you just would rather stick to what you believe in and remain steadfast with those values, or if it's the fact that like it's a sort of fear of changing those ideas and those ideas like evolving over time and with new perspectives.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah. Um, I really like that. And I wanted to ask, like, if we're saying that like inauthenticity is sort of like could sort of be like an intentional thing, I guess if someone like if I realize that I'm doing something that's perhaps inauthentic and it could perhaps be intentional, like is there like a real urgency for me to change my actions? Like how urgent is it for me to say like, oh, I'm doing something bad by being inauthentic? And like is the urgency associated with that as strong as if you were like committing like a moral wrong or something like that?
Uh, I think that precisely because I think what most of us agreed just now, in that authenticity is completely separate from morality. I think that there is maybe less of an urgency. I think that's really interesting because I think that if one is being inauthentic to themselves and they're not necessarily being moral, immoral, truthful, untruthful, um, there's less of like there's almost sort of like an innocence or a like lack of bad intentions within that. So I think that maybe there is definitely less of an urgency, but I don't necessarily know whether that's the right or wrong thing.
Agree with that because I think I would view authenticity a lot of, and we kind of mentioned it. I think of it a lot as a virtue, and I think someone else who put this idea in the chat again is the idea of like self-deception. And so I think that this idea of being inauthentic to oneself is not being true to oneself, and how much you're harming yourself in that or not, as could vary by degree. But I would agree in saying that being inauthentic and like I guess morally harming another person would I guess not be as urgent, but still very important as a from a moral perspective. Very much so in like the virtue ethicist idea of continuing to strive for the virtues with authenticity being one. So I would say it would be less urgent in the sense that you're not directly harming another moral agent, because if you're being immoral in that sense, then their well-being is being compromised. But I think for your well-being, striving for the virtue of authenticity would be something important that you should recognize. That if you recognize, you definitely should be trying to strive to change.
I agree with that. And going back to what Justin had said earlier about authenticity and accountability, I think that accountability is one of the most important parts or like moral aspects of authenticity. Um, so yeah, I think that if you can recognize that you're being inauthentic, sort of beginning to take responsibility for your actions and your thoughts, I think that's definitely morally important. Um,
Kind of expanding on this topic is a question about whether or not authenticity is something that is only of um, value to you, or whether your authenticity is something that is a value to a community too. Um, and is it worth being authentic and sharing a view even though you know it may not get through to other people or even resonate with them at all. Like should authenticity ever be based in striving to maybe change someone else's view or remain true to yourself in expressing your own view? I know we've sort of touched on something similar to this before, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, I think that authenticity is definitely something that should be strived for as a personal goal and not strive for as something, I guess, for the perception of other people. I think that striving to be authentic oneself can definitely have benefits for those people. And especially with social media nowadays, authenticity is kind of a value that's placed higher than I guess I would say it was before, as being authentic as being something that's important and being inauthentic as something that's I guess not viewed as positively. But I definitely think that being authentic is something that should be personally strived for, and that is something that in and of itself will then benefit other people and the community in the same way.
Karen, when you mentioned, you know, the belief in the earth being flat, it kind of got me thinking about metaphysical relativism and if in any sense in or any way could being so authentic to yourself, could that lead to a more metaphysical relativist view and perspective of the world? So then kind of posing this broader question of, is there such thing as too much authenticity? Can someone be too authentic to their beliefs and values?
Was that a question to me, Mina, or just tossed out?
Just tossed out, but you're welcome to answer it if you want.
No, no, I defer to the panelists. It's such a great question.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say that is a really interesting question to think about as authenticity as something that could be too much. I think initially my thoughts are there'd be a difference between being authentic and I guess I feel like the assumed notion is like I guess oversharing one's opinions or like overstepping in that way. And I think that it's hard to say one can be too authentic because I guess being too true to oneself, I think there's no such thing. If you want to rephrase it, it's being like being the most like oneself or too much like oneself. And I think that that's something that it's hard to say you can be too much of yourself or too much like yourself. But I do think that in the same way, oversharing one's authentic opinions could be something that's not necessarily the best or correct for other people, as that can obviously lead to certain issues that arise or conflicts in that same way. And so I think if we're thinking about the matter of authenticity on its own, I would say it's not something you can have in excess. But I guess in the ways of being feeling too convicted to then share that in every scenario is something that I could definitely see as something that could be excessive and then harmful.
Yeah, I actually wonder if maybe we can have too much authenticity, um, in a way that if we like think about the idea that or like the existentialist notion that we're always becoming, we're not fixed people. But then if we cling so much onto this one strand of authenticity, if we cling so much onto this is who I am, this is what I believe in, this is what I advocate for, then that almost treats our current self as something that's unchangeable, something that isn't going to like something very, very much fixed and like stable. And I wonder if that refusal of growth to preserve this like perception of authenticity almost like turns into this like form of like bad faith, like you become this like sort of static object in which you refuse to grow and move because you're clinging so hard onto this authenticity, like, or this idea in the name of authenticity, at least.
I think another interesting way to look at this is through maybe more of a political lens. I think we're in a really interesting place politically right now with a lot of polarization. And I know there was a question in the chat about whether or not it's possible to maintain authenticity while being a part of a political party.
Mm, I wonder if maybe almost like democracy as a theory um, sort of forces certain politicians to maintain like some authenticity. I think maybe democracy is a way in which like we preserve authenticity within politics because then politicians have this like accountability, this reason to sort of do what they said, like as we earlier defined authenticity as like following up on what you say you're going to do. I think maybe democracy sort of is a like is a way in which we can ensure this. But then again, I don't always think that we get authenticity within politics. I don't always think that's the case.
I think that within political parties, like let's say within like a two-party system or something like that, I think it is possible to have authentic political beliefs and then to align yourself with a party that maybe represents those beliefs a bit more. But I do think that, and this sort of connects to what Rania was saying earlier about, being too authentic, whether you're clinging to a version of yourself or clinging to something in order to stop growth and because like your focus is on that particular identity. And so I think that if the focus shifts from, oh, I believe in these um, values because I should and because they align with other things that I think or they align with people that I surround myself with. Um, so I think it is possible to have your own ideas and to if you see people that align with those ideas to support those people or become a member of that party. But I think you sort of still have to maintain that like critical thinking sense if you want to continue being authentic. So to continue questioning like whether or not this is something you truly believe in or whether or not you're believing in it because it's sort of comfortable.
I think we're just about out of time, but I do quickly want to say that when I read that question, I viewed it from the perspective of someone who is like part of a political party as like a political actor in it, and it got me thinking about the Citizens United case and how so much of policy and decision making is dictated by money and what will make the most money now. And just kind of to leave everyone on the question of how has consumerism and money and like the whole capitalistic system in its entirety affected and influenced our ability to be authentic and maybe a different sense. But anyway, with that, I think that's it for tonight. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and I'm going to hand it back over to Karen.
Thank you, Mina, and thanks to all our panelists. You are wonderful, wonderful philosophers. It's been a delight to listen and think along with you. I'm going to be thinking about, I'm going to go home. Well, I am home, but I'm going to be thinking tonight about whether I'm too authentically myself in front of my 20-year-old's friends. Right? Like, I wonder about parenting and the ways in which we might be too authentic in ways that our kids don't like. And so many great questions here too about whether a commitment to authenticity can overwhelm our commitment to growth and just so many beautiful questions for us all to chew on and talk with others with. So I want to say thank you so much to our panelists and to Mina for doing such a great job moderating and sharing your thinking, everyone. This is what it's all about, is recognizing, right, that everyone has thoughts and great thinking to share. And you all demonstrated that so beautifully today. So thanks everyone for coming and for supporting. And we'll see you at the next PLATO